Recording, please.
Yeah, that's done. Thanks.
Thank you. Great. Okay, so yeah, welcome to gov.uk Forms at Data Connect 23, or to give you the full title of the presentation, using gov.uk Forms to collect higher quality data and gain better insights. Let's start with some introductions. Before I introduce myself, it'd be really useful to know a little bit more about who you are. So if you could just pop into the chat your job title and your department, it'll just help us to understand who's here. So I'll just give everyone a couple of moments to do that. Content designer, analyst, business analyst, asset class engineer, brilliant. Developer, service designer, great. We've got a good mix of people. Thanks for that. So yeah, keep them coming. It's really useful to know who else is here in the audience. I'll introduce myself. My name's James Shepherd. I'm a lead technical architect at the Government Digital Service.
And I'm Anne Carr. I'm a senior performance analyst at the Government Digital Service.
So the Government Digital Service is often referred to as GDS, and we're here to make digital government simpler, clearer, and faster for everyone. One of our responsibilities is to maintain a clear and easy to navigate and welcoming front door to government. So hopefully you're all familiar with gov.uk. We also build common platforms to help departments make better digital services. So for example, the design system, pay and notify. And there's a range of these products which have the gov.uk prefix, including gov.uk itself. So there's several listed there, and gov.uk Forms is just one of those. GDS was also involved in the digital transformation of 25 exemplar services about 10 years ago. And the idea was to make digital services so good people prefer to use them. Now that might not seem like much now, but back then it was a fairly radical idea. And of course, those thoughts have developed, and now it's fairly commonplace, and people in fact do often prefer to use digital services. So let's look specifically at gov.uk Forms. We want every form on gov.uk to be accessible, easy to use, and quick to process. And so it might be worth taking a moment to consider what we actually mean by a form. And of course, I went to Wikipedia for a definition, which states a form is a document with spaces, also named fields or placeholders, in which to write or select. And forms, when completed, may be a statement, a request, an order, etc. So to be specific for gov.uk Forms, our focus is on forms that are published on gov.uk and get submitted to government. So for example, there are forms which are used between a landlord and tenants, and that doesn't involve government. So we're specifically interested in those that are published on gov.uk and submitted to government. The oldest example of a government form I could find was this one, the form of coroner's return as to deaths caused by railway accidents prescribed by the Secretary of State in 1885. And this is what it looks like. You can see it on the legislation.gov.uk website if you're interested in it. And you can see, I don't know if you can make out just on the bottom left there, it talks about this is part of the Railway Regulation Act, and it lists a number of bits of information that need to be gathered. So perhaps to make it a bit more modern, looking at a more recent example form, let's look at register to vote. So register to vote looks a bit like this, 3 pages, which could be printed out or could be done electronically. And on that point, generally we think of forms are either paper forms where they've literally been printed out on paper. And there can be some overlap there with document-based forms. So you might have a PDF that you print out, or you might complete it electronically on a computer. So we kind of can categorize those two things together as paper forms and document-based forms. And the Register to Vote service was actually part of that. It was one of those 25 services, which was part of the transformation about 10 years ago, and was turned into something that looks a bit like this. So you may be familiar with this notion of one thing per page. A user's guided through and eventually get this check your answers pattern at the end to help them be sure that they've provided the correct information before they submit the form. From discovery through to live, it was just over 2 years, and quite a lot of usage there. You know, we're talking about millions of people interacting with that service on an annual basis. And that's just one form. So the question is, how many forms are there? Gov.uk has a search API that allows you to get useful information about the content on gov.uk. And there's a really helpful blog post I read which talks about how to use the API and just make some suggestions. So there you can see the URL, which is the kind of the root of the search API. And it also talks about total fields, which is indeed quite useful. So if you go to the API, and in fact I've used this count equals 0, which means I'm not actually looking at the data. I'm just interested in the kind of the totals of it. I've left some of the information out, but you get a field here. So that there, total 592069. That's the number of content items that the API has returned back from gov.uk. So that's everything on gov.uk. If we add in a filter to a document type of form, that brings it down to just over 5,000. And you can use this concept called facets to break that down by organisation, so government department or arm's length body or whatever. And that brings it down to 133 different organisations owning these forms. Now the data is starting to get quite complicated here. So I used a tool called JQ, which enables you to process JSON. And then just running through that on the command line, you can start to break down which departments or which organisations have how many forms. So at the top here, HMCTS, then HMRC and so on. But there's 133 of these entries with the numbers going down each time. So these numbers relate to a page on gov.uk that literally says form at the top and then some information below it. But actually, the image on the right, that's lower down the page. There's multiple attachments to this page. So we're not actually talking about a form here. We're effectively talking about a form page or a form container, which itself might have multiple forms. So just a couple of caveats on those numbers I showed you earlier. That 5,000-ish number was the number of form pages, and it is possible to have multiple forms on a page. Sometimes you have forms which aren't actually categorized as forms, so that means the number will be even higher than that. And there are even a few cases when a page claims to be a form page, but there's actually no forms on that. It's less frequent, but it does happen. So going back to the gov.uk forms plan or idea to get every form on gov.uk accessible, easy to use, and quick to process. But it's that every word. So we talked about the exemplar transformation and spending a couple of years to build really good, high quality digital services. But hopefully you can see that kind of level of effort won't scale to thousands of forms. So what gov.uk forms allows you to do is to create an online form in minutes without needing technical knowledge. And I'm just going to give you a brief, not a demo, but I'll show you some of the screens from how it looks for a user. So this is a screen capture from our development environment. There's a green button to invite you to create a form. First thing you do is to give the form a name. So here we've just got a demo for Data Connect 23. And then you're into a kind of a task list pattern, which clearly lays out the steps you need to go through, starting with naming your form, adding questions, adding a declaration, and so on. And these are all the steps you need to go through to create a form which is ready to be published on gov.uk. You start by adding questions, and the first part of adding a question in our flow is to get the user to think about the type of information they're gathering, because that has further implications. So in this case, we want the user to select from a list of options. You specify a question. So here I'm just saying, would you like to receive higher quality data? Hopefully I know what the answer is for everyone. but then you define what your options are. You can say whether you want people to select only one option or multiple options, and yes and no here. And then the metadata around the kind of the question, that first question we're asking, is summarized to the user. You can then preview what that question is going to look like, and so it looks something like this. And it's clearly indicating that this is currently a draft form, but you get an idea of what the user is going to see when they actually see this for themselves. So hopefully you can see that where in the past, maybe one of the barriers to creating an online form is to have technical knowledge and the technical experience to do that. Obviously, you still need the domain knowledge, you still need to know what kind of questions you need to ask, how to kind of make the content of the form good. But what gov.uk Forms does is reduce or even remove that barrier to needing specific technical knowledge to build and host web applications. We're currently in a private beta phase, so this from the service manual. Most services start out in a private beta phase that allows them to limit who's using it, and it means you can work more closely with a limited number of people, get feedback and improve it. But we do hope to offer gov.uk Forms out to a wider audience later this year. So to help you visualize things a bit more, gov.uk Forms is used to create a form. Once that form is created, it gets published on gov.uk. So what that means is there'll be a link when people visit gov.uk, and that link will link to the form that's hosted on gov.uk Forms. Someone could then come to Forms and start filling that in, and when they completed it, when they submit the form, it will be sent by email to a team email inbox. And in fact, that's how quite a lot of the document-based forms on gov.uk currently work. People are invited to download the form, fill it in, attach it to an email, and send it back. What we're hoping to offer in the future is some form of API integration. So that dashed line indicating that it's not in place, but it's something we're working on. And so it might be that for whatever reason, maybe you've got quite a good technical capability, maybe you've got your own way of processing form applications. You might be interested in receiving these forms via API. So here's the first prompt to you as the audience to think about, to discuss later. What, in your mind, what would that Forms API integration look like? And how would having an API integration help you to process forms quicker? I think I'm now passing over to Anne.
Okay, we're just going to talk about collecting higher quality data. So there's problems with document-based forms, missing data. If a user doesn't know something offhand, they may just skip that question. And incorrect data, that can be something like using a date that doesn't exist, like the 30th of February. And there's often a big disconnect between form owners and form processors. Processors often aren't sure of who the form owners and creators are to be able to pass on the problems with forms submitted. And this often means that submitted document forms consistently have the same problems. For example, users are confused about a reference number that they've asked for. And this can result in form processors needing to have additional contact with the form completer. Currently, we validate fields such as dates, email address, number of fields, and we'll continue to do this as we add more question types. Now, there is some data which is department specific. For example, unique taxpayer reference in HMRC and various license types in DEFRA. So in the future, we could look at having custom data validation. So as James previously said, gov.uk Forms submissions are sent by email to the group email accounts in departments. Although many PDFs published on gov.uk are interactive, there are also many which users are not able to fill in on a desktop or other device. And if users don't have a printer or access to a printer, they can't use the service. If they have to print off the form to complete it and don't have a scanner, they will often take a photo of the completed form and email it. If they don't do that, they may have to post in the completed form, and they'll have to pay for a stamp and take the time to go to the post office and queue. And it's £1.20 for a first-class stamp these days. So how many forms do you receive each week? Now, that's a simple question, but most of the teams we've worked with have no clear idea of the number of forms they complete. Because forms typically come into a shared inbox and there'll be multiple people processing them, and also differing volumes of forms throughout the year, it's difficult for them to know the actual volumes. With one of our first partners, we asked them to log the volumes received daily, and they did that for 10 days. Now, that might have been an atypical 10 days, or perhaps there was maybe some people weren't following the logging process correctly, but the actual volumes of submissions that they have are much, much higher than those they logged in that 10 days. So we do custom logging. So what we log is the form title and URL and the event action. So we have lots of different event actions. So the first page save, and then all of the subsequent pages have page saves. And there's a special one for if the question's optional or can be skipped. Then check your answers, and then where answers are amended from the check your answers page, and then submissions. And then the question number and question text. And we don't log the content of form responses. So getting better insights. On which questions cause the most problems? So understanding the pain points and exits for the form can help form builders to understand what to focus on to improve the performance of their form. If they've previously been receiving paper forms, they won't have any indications of how many people are just abandoning their form or whereabouts in the form they gave up. So by using custom logging, form creators can see where users are abandoning their form. They can also measure improvements when they've made changes. Maritime and Coast Guard Agency, for example, have made iterative changes to their form and to their guidance, which has improved their completion rate. So one of the biggest dropout points was question 2. So question 1 asks which area you want to volunteer in, and then it asks you which Coast Guard station. As you can see here, there's an awful lot of stations, and this was the only way that users had of finding where the Coast Guard stations were, which was not entirely helpful to users. So MCA oh, sorry, next slide. So you can see there's a big dropout at question 2, and then another one at question 8. And question 8's more tricky because it asks for a personal statement. Why do you want to join the Maritime and Coast Guard Agency? And that's probably going to be a very difficult one for them to solve because that's you know, very much a personal thing. We're currently working on providing self-service analytics for form builders. At the moment, the gov.uk team, forms team, generates the reports and sends them out by email. And obviously this isn't sustainable, and we need to have self-service analytics in place when we start increasing the number of forms at scale. So what's the forms completion rate? And again, if a team's got no idea how many people are attempting to complete a form, they'll have no idea of the completion rate. Now, we did do some research into the number of downloads of PDF from gov.uk compared to the number of people successfully accessing a service. It was difficult to find publicly available data that we could match to download data, but we did find a few. One was Disability Living Allowance, which provides stats on the numbers of claims which are less than 3 months old. And we were able to match the period with the number of downloads of the PDF from gov.uk, which was recorded in Google Analytics. we found there are around 10 downloads of the PDF per successful application. I mean, obviously there's some caveats to that number. We don't know how many unsuccessful applications there were. We treat a click on a link to a PDF as a download with no knowledge of whether it was a successful download. And GA only collects data when the user has explicitly consented. I could go on, there's lots of other caveats. And we've got the opportunity to start to benchmark performance. Clearly, there'll be a different benchmark for a form with 5 straightforward questions and forms with 15 questions, including a long text with, why do you want to become a licensed juggler, which require more time and thought. With multiple form builders in use or being developed across government, there's an opportunity to share learnings, such as the range of completion rates or which question types lead to abandonment. We're doing user research with our current form builders to find out what other data would be useful for them, but would welcome any suggestions. I think it's back to you, James.
Thank you, Anne. Another question that it's worth asking in terms of people who have forms is what user feedback they get. So to take the register to vote example again, right down at the bottom of that quite long page, there's a little, is this page useful? Yes, no button. And some users may find it, but some users may not, particularly if they've kind of gone through the process of downloading the form and they've already left the page. But when users do click on one of these buttons, it ends up in a system called gov.uk content data, which is available to content designers across government. And you can see that here I've sorted it by the kind of the most useful forms, but the data is fairly slim. So even though some of them have 100% useful responses, that's only based on one response. And we've also got some indicative number of unique page views, which again is driven by Google Analytics, which isn't entirely accurate. But it's useful to give an indication. But how could we improve on these? So one option is as part of the confirmation page pattern. So when someone goes through and fills in a form on gov.uk forms, they do get a confirmation page at the end. And at that point, we could prompt the user if they wanted to provide some specific feedback on how useful they found the service. So this clearly that can be done as a kind of yes or no thing. It could be a score rating, or it could include free text. But then you're getting into there's more challenges and complications when you allow people to provide free text, but then potentially get better insights from it. The service standard point 10 talks about defining what success looks like and publishing performance data. And to stick with our example of register to vote, they have a really excellent performance dashboard. And it shows things like the number of applications in the last 24 hours in 5-minute periods. It shows the split between online applications and postal applications. And it shows an aggregate or a kind of an average, I suppose, of user satisfaction. And these are exactly the sort of analytics which gov.uk forms could provide as a self-service or even published to the general public option. But what register to vote performance are able to do that we wouldn't be able to do is something like this, where, for example, applications are broken down by age group. And because we quite deliberately don't retain or look at the content of the forms, because they could be used for anything, we wouldn't be able to do this kind of level of insight in terms of the data within the form itself. That would have to be done by the department receiving the form application. Just briefly on form metadata. So we've talked about the kind of the forms, and the obvious thing about a form is what questions it asks and where those forms go to. But there are other interesting questions, or certainly interesting to me, in terms of whether, who owns that form. That could be an individual, it could be a team, it could be a whole department, who created the form, who most recently, or who has edited it over time. And perhaps a more fundamental point, going back to the example right at the start of that the form from the 1800s, what legislation caused that form to exist in the first place? Because most, I'm not going to say most, some forms obviously exist because of government legislation, and whilst it's maybe implicitly known what that link is, would there be any value in modelling that? So that's another question to you. Is there form metadata which you think you'd find useful, which isn't typically captured anywhere? And finally, as part of the presentation, before we move into the discussion section, just something on reusing data. The service manual encourages sharing and reusing data. So I'll just read this out. You should consider how other teams may benefit from using the data you collect so that you can make it as reusable as possible. In addition, your service may be better to use and easier to run if it gets data from other parts of government. So hopefully it's obvious what the benefits are, but particularly this first point, if you reuse data, that can improve the quality of services by avoiding asking users for more information than is necessary. So if a user has in some way or another provided some information into government, from their point of view, they, in some cases at least, they might prefer it if we don't ask the same questions again. So have a think about what existing data you might be able to use in your forms, or conversely, what data that's gathered in your forms might be able to be used elsewhere. But importantly, how can we model that data? How can we reference that? And how can we do that in a secure way? So thanks everyone. If you'd like to learn more about gov.uk forms, there's the link to our product page. I'll put some links in the chat as well, so you've got them there. And also, if you have access to Slack, please come and join us on gov.uk-forms on the UK Government Digital Slack, and we can have a conversation there too. So I think, Rachel, please can we stop the recording there and we'll move into the questions and discussion part?
Yeah, sure. I'm just thinking you don't want that bit recorded.
No, we're going to stop the recording now, please.